Hello, OWASP Ottawa, and welcome to August. Hope everybody's keeping well and enjoying your summer. We're really particularly lucky today in Ottawa because in downtown Ottawa, we actually have electricity, which is something that we didn't have yesterday. So timing is everything. Although I am told that the weather report has funnel clouds over the city, so, cross your fingers. It's either Hydro 1, Customer 0, or maybe everything will work. So before we kick off our presentation for August, I want to go through a couple of important things associated with OWASP. First of all, if you need to get in touch with us, we're on all the usual channels. Obviously, if you're watching us on YouTube, you know our YouTube channel, but we also have Slack and a LinkedIn and a Twitter. What else is important? Do you want to present to OWASP Ottawa? Give us a shout. We are interested in anything security or AppSec related, and we will accept times associated with your talking in front of people comfort level. Some important releases. The OWASP ZAP, the main project, one of the main projects in OWASP needs help. So if you're looking to contribute, here are some important links. And speaking about ZAP, this week's weekly build has moved the Spider from a core piece to an add-on. And that also means that the Spider all the tools that leverage the original Spider will now leverage the add-on. And this will be a significant component change in 2.12. There's a new add-on in a parameter digger, and check out the link for a blog report on it. It's an interesting tool that will help you find parameters that may not necessarily be apparent in an application. So we've been broadcasting from the COVID bunker for about 2 and a bit years now. So we've been mulling over the notion of going back to an in-person meetup. Now, to be absolutely clear, we will not, I repeat, not stop broadcasting using YouTube. And so we will continue with that. We will just be in a room with other humans. So if that's something that you're interested in showing up to, it will be masked. We have found a venue. It will be close to the old venue, but we're going to be trying it out in a mock meetup to make sure that we can broadcast and that they too give us internet, and just to make sure the lights work and the gravity works. So enough about that. Let's introduce this evening's speaker. Carla, welcome.
Hi.
Carla is a force majeure in the world of security, and this is from direct experience. She's based in the US, and she's a security partner at Gusto, which is starting to make that sound. That name sort of makes me hungry already. She's got experience in security incident response. She has experience as an application security engineer and a QA engineer. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you, Garth. So
I'll give it over to you.
Thank you. Will there be pizza in person? I hope so. That would be fun. So I'm able to see what comments that y'all are saying on YouTube. So if you have any, feel free to type them in and I'll be able to see them. So let's begin. As professionals or enthusiasts in application security, what are your first thoughts when you see this adjective, unhackable? Any answers? Okay, well, I'll tell you what I
might suggest unbelievable.
Yeah, right? So for sure, as Garth said, that's unbelievable, right? We know that inevitably everything is vulnerable to something, right? And in a way that can mean that we're failing some way in security. And today I'm going to talk about what it takes to develop and scale out security programs, especially an effective security incident response program. Failure is inevitable in information security because if a system exists, it needs to be secured. It is when we are able to fail gracefully in expectation of failure that helps us master our response to it. I believe that this can be accomplished by collecting and organizing historic failures and learning from the past to make the present better. Today, I will describe systems that I've seen in American medicine and aviation that can be directly applied to security systems I have built or supported that steers into the curve of failure. So an explicit warning, failures in aviation and medicine lead to death and injury, and we've had a crazy 3 years, so absolutely no judgment if you don't want to hear about this stuff. And a Canadian flavored warning, sorry for all the US-centric references, I am an American, but the joke is on me because my Canadian friends brag about 2-click tax filings and nationalized healthcare, so haha. Why am I qualified to talk about incident response and how to improve it? Well, at present, I'm a security partner at Gusto, and Garth has already said these things, but all of my experiences greatly motivate my work as a security partner. And I joke to all of my new peers at Gusto that I use all my trauma from the security incident response to try and stop those things from happening at Gusto. So, haha, that's the joke. And I was also a contributor to a book that was recently published. This was called Reinventing Cybersecurity. My chapter title is specifically called Confronting Inherently Flawed Systems. Hi, hello, I am an inherently flawed system, and I've statistically suffered more failures than neurotypical people. I compare confronting my own undiagnosed ADHD symptoms to how I confronted failure and inherently flawed systems in computing and incident response. I have heard some things about Doug Ford as a result of your nationalized healthcare, and I am very sorry to hear about it. So let's get started. Dealing with security feels like an endless, repetitive cycle. Something bad happens, you deal with it in the moment. The problem returns in another context, maybe some details are changed, maybe it happens in the same exact way. Information security Twitter is rife with examples about people lamenting this state of affairs and pointing out failures. For example, the high-level goal of an incident usually is to, in addition to mitigating a particular vulnerability, it is to help prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. To do that, we need to build an effective program that holistically tackles all the incidents that occur over time and integrates all the experience and learning from each in order to make us really effective at incident response. This is key so that we don't have to read the same sad stories over and over again, and it's not an easy task. I may as well be asking how to boil the ocean. And global warming aside, is that even possible? No. As we know, boiling the ocean is not possible, which brings me to the first historic lesson that I believe we can learn in solving these problems, which is to compare it to engineering. Engineering has always been about the ability to problem solve, and the benefits of computers have always been about the ability to problem solve at scale. The way that computing solves these problems is by recognizing the pattern of issues and resolving each issue in such a way that can answer little questions, kind of like binary, right? However, the scale of problems solved by computers also scales the issues in security. So too must we rely on pattern recognition and breaking down huge problems into smaller yes or no questions. Returning to the definition of an incident, an event or occurrence, in security, we face thousands of incidents every day. So where do we start? When first starting out in putting together an incident response program, we're babies who don't even know how to crawl. And in order to walk and run, we first need to learn how to crawl. This applies to any problem, any complex task, and any hurdle. Security being the huge mess as it is, it's good to draw inspiration from the people who know what they're doing when they're faced with a huge mess. Marie Kondo famously enabled people to tackle large anxiety-inducing situations in organizing their homes. Like engineering, she has a script that allows her to break things down into smaller problems. She asks the people she helps to put everything in one pile, label each item one by one to keep, donate, or trash. She teaches them to organize items to keep it in such a way that can be easily cataloged. And then she asks you to repeat this process over different categories like clothes, books, and sentimental items. If we match Marie Kondo's method to crawling, walking, and running, we can similarly apply a pattern when solving problems. We must scope, quantify, and recognize patterns before we can scale problem resolution to meet the supply and scale of the problems that we have. In this pattern of problem solving, we can directly apply Marie Kondo's method to security incidents by putting all the reports in one place, prioritizing vulnerabilities, risks, and efforts, recognizing patterns by organizing this information in vulnerability management programs and risk registers. And we must do all of this before we can effectively leverage the wealth of data available to iterate and scale upon processes and responses to any given security incident. So let's focus on how to prioritize risks, vulnerabilities, and efforts. I don't think excess has ever sparked joy. Let's start by learning how to crawl and walk by prioritizing. So what is a vulnerability? It's a flaw in a system that weakens the overall security of that system. And in general, we know that a confirmed vulnerability usually has a fairly clear course of action if you know what it is, right? You either mitigate it or you completely eliminate it. Which brings me to my first example reference in the field of aviation. This is a diagram depicting the necessary components of an airport when landing a plane. So most airports in the US have an authority called ATC. They're called also known as air traffic control. So how does ATC prioritize which plane lands first? Well, in the best case scenario, it's done by schedule. And in the rare case that something happens, the schedule has to be disrupted. Thanks to experience, ATC knows what to do if they encounter a disruption. When all systems are normal, for example, aircrafts that happen to be at the same altitude legally are given priority based on their maneuverability. So hot air balloons can't really maneuver, right? Can't really pilot that as easily. They have the right of way over gliders. Gliders have the right of way over airships, and airships have right of way over airplanes. Airplanes have the most maneuverability out of all these categories. They also carry the most passengers on a yearly basis. But what if one of the aircrafts are vulnerable to something? What if multiple aircrafts are in distress at the same time? So in a landing emergency, for example, the scope of the problem includes the number of planes that are in the expected in the airspace. And they quantify the situation. So they have to figure out, what's the emergency? Is the plane on fire? Is there a medical emergency or an equipment failure? They always ask, what are the number of souls on board? And they always ask, finally, what is the amount of fuel available in the plane? The number of planes nearby and each of their stats related to the distress, the number of souls, and the amount of fuel helps them prioritize. This allows them to organize and make decisions with respect to where these planes should go. Planes with enough resources can hold at different altitudes, and planes with enough resources or that are far away enough can divert to other airports safely. Most importantly, they can clear the runway for the plane that is in distress. At scale, everybody writes a report, and you can actually gather data from black boxes, which is our equivalent of application logging. The FAA, which stands for the Federal Aviation Administration in the US, and the NTSB, also known as the National Transportation Safety Board, investigates any sort of accidents that happen. If something happens with a pilot or is a pilot mistake, for example, pilots are required to go on check rides in which an instructor is actually inspecting their technique and their form. And also the FAA and NTSB will update procedures if necessary, which I'll go into really extensive detail later. So how do we apply this to vulnerabilities? Well, back when I was a baby application security engineer, I had one pile of things to manage, which was bug bounty vulnerability reports. And I needed to be able to quantify the severity of each report. And so there were a bunch of ways that I was able to do this. So in my journey with AppSec and bug bounties, the art of priority lacked consistency and communication when I tried to prioritize everything by myself, right? The way that BugCrowd resolved this for me was the VRT. We used it as the baseline when it was first introduced in 2016, and it was an excellent starting place. This was built with an application security context to start, and gave us guidelines to start from, a great framework to start more from. So the VRT has itself evolved to cover even more context than it originally did. And the early versions of the VRT best served me in an AppSec context until I switched to security incident response. The number of incident reports and their resolutions far exceeded my team's time, resource, and mental constraints. And security incident response is much more demanding in having clear prioritization standards. So when my team was struggling with this, your OWASP co-lead, Garth Boyd, comes in like a shining hero and tells us, have you ever heard of a CVSS calculator? Literally his third day of employment there. So, and yeah, I can credit him to bringing this particular standard to my attention, and it has dictated a lot of decisions that I have made in my career. So, what is the CVSS calculator? So CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Score System. And what I loved about it is that it covered every situation to computers. It accounts for the CIA triangle, which we all know as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And it accounts for vulnerabilities across products, computers, and network security. The base metric group, as we see here, accounts for exploitability and directly incorporates the impact to the said CIA triangle. The base metric, temporal metrics allow you to also determine what the score is in terms of 0 days or patch vulnerabilities, because that affects the likelihood of your vulnerability getting exploited. Finally, the environmental metric group accounts for special circumstances related to your environment. So in my original bug bounty, we actually reserved the right to deviate from the VRT because there were product contexts that we wanted to account for. And so sometimes we raised the priority of a vulnerability report if we thought it had a bigger impact than initially triaged. And sometimes we lowered it as a result of impact based off of what the product demand was. This is used commonly, right? Every CVE has a CVSS score. If everybody speaks the same language, communication is faster and less mistakes are made as a result of miscommunication. The nice thing also was that colleagues and I were never more than a full number off when it came to comparing our CVSS evaluations, which meant we were at least precise with our evaluations of priorities and vulnerabilities. And then I also like to tag additional data with respect to my bug bounty, my bug bounty program. Sorry for the stuttering. These were example metrics that I found useful to track data in my bug bounty. Like that included vulnerability categories, which teams owned them, what repository, when we notified teams, and when they resolved them. And all of these were actually partially inspired by Arkady Tettleman, who gave a really excellent talk at BSides SF in 2018 called Data Driven Bug Bounty. Having all of this quantified data allowed me to track our resolved open or overdue issues, the vuln categories and their prominence, and this information also told us which services or teams to focus effort on. And then in order to run, iterate, or evolve from that, all of the same information collected over time gave us database decisions in terms of which tools to prioritize in building or installing or resolving these issues at scale, how to recognize trends of vulnerabilities tied to specific categories like products or organizations, which secure code training topics to develop or improve upon. I eventually applied these similar statistics to security incident response vulnerabilities. Thanks to all of my aggregate data related to my bug bounty, I knew on a monthly, quarterly, and yearly basis what our most common vulnerability categories were, and I could tailor secure code training and content to specifically promote awareness, mitigations, and best practices. I could pinpoint which teams had the most overdue issues and how many days overdue. The CTO would request each team to prioritize issues. Obviously, the longer discovered vulnerabilities were sitting around on a system, the more likely the issue would be exploited by malicious actors. This data helped my developers reset their priorities, especially with issues that were overdue. More interesting was the trend on the chart on the right. So sometime in 2017, I had built an automatic reminder bot for overdue issues. And on November 2018, because I'm a terrible programmer, I realized my reminder bot was broken. In investigating this failure, my logging told me that reminders stopped in April 2018. The number of overdue issues, as seen in the green graph, spiked upwards since April until it was discovered in November. I turned the bot back on and the number of overdue issues starts going down. The number of overdue issues continued to trend downward into 2019 as indicated in yellow. I would not have noticed this trend if I had not gathered the data and tracked the behavior. Yeah, I gotta work on my software engineering skills. I go into more details about the findings from this accidental experiment in developer behavior in my talk at Peninsula called Hacking Habits. Prioritizing when and how to solve vulnerabilities ultimately reduces risks. And when I approach teams with known vulnerabilities, usually the conversation is to illustrate the impact in such a way that can be compared to their pre-existing priorities. When we're able to agree upon that, usually something can get prioritized. So what about everything in security that doesn't have a clear success criteria, like mitigating a known vulnerability? How do we prioritize a risk? Should I have water in here? Yes. Just a second, sorry. So how do we prioritize a risk? Risk is a potential loss, right? It's a chance or situation that could lead to said losses. And looking to other industries and how they handle risks, we can actually look to medicine. In medicine, the risk is death or permanent injury. When you walk into an American emergency room, how do they prioritize patients when it's not clear what the root cause is? So let's take, for example, me. In April 2021, I was in a super bad way, and thankfully it was not COVID, but I was really worried about taking a bed from a really severe COVID patient. And when everything was said and done, I actually researched how hospitals triage patients in an emergency room. So this is an example of a chart of an emergency room triage priority from Wikipedia, which means that, I don't know, at least that has an international context, I hope. So the triage nurse checks for things like, are you choking or is your throat actively closing up? What's your oxygen rate? What's your heart rate? What's your blood pressure? What's your coherency? They take a blood test and a urine test, and I was actually solidly between a 3 and a 4 in this particular chart. And I was actually really glad to see this because, yeah, everyone that's red, orange, yellow ahead of me, please process them first. I don't want to, like, in all likelihood, I would probably die after months or years of neglect for my issue compared to everybody else, right? So in the context of prioritizing risk in the emergency room, we see how an emergency room quantifies, recognizes patterns, and applies treatments at scale. So how can we apply this to security risks? With risks, our piles are every risk identified, the threat models we perform, the audits, review findings, bug bounty vulnerabilities. And to crawl, therefore quantify, we need to be able to calculate the risk, the possibility of a risk. We need to be able to calculate the possibility of a risk happening and what the impact is. How do you perfectly calculate the possibility of a risk? You can't, and you certainly cannot do this exactly perfectly or at scale. In complex systems, there are thousands of factors to be aware of. Computing possibilities of millions of potential outcomes is impossible and, quite frankly, a waste of time. An example of how complex this is demonstrated in that TV show, maybe I'm aging myself, but House. The show demonstrates how difficult diagnostic medicine can be. All of those conflicting systems, like in the human body, endocrine, vascular, neural, pulmonary, can conflict and manifest as similar enough symptoms to the point where House, like, no offense to him and his team of doctors, essentially throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And so the easiest way to prioritize a task is to crawl and to quantify it. And a common way to do that is to use the impact versus likelihood matrix. You take a risk and you consider how likely it is to happen, and you evaluate what's the damage if it isn't mitigated and is actually exploited. But I actually don't think this is the most precise way of prioritizing your risks. I do believe that there's a benefit in that it at least is helpful in mapping your priorities and, more importantly, gets you over decision paralysis. A few downsides include the fact that it doesn't account for, like, when people evaluate risks, they do it differently. Everybody's version of unlikely, extremely common, rare, they're slightly different from each other. And as a result, there's a book that pretty much states that the errors lead to worse than random outcomes. That's this book. Therefore, it is not my preference to solely rely on impact versus effort as a first case basis. And yeah, in How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity and Risk, Douglas Hubbard postulates that there is no reason to reinvent quantitative methods, which brings us back to the CVSS calculator. CVSS already accounts for likelihood by quantifying exploitability as well as impact. There's really no need to reinvent the wheel. First.org is one of the hosts of a CVSS calculator tool, and it actually documents the history and evolution of the calculator to demonstrate improvement and evolution in precision. With that understanding, it actually improves my confidence in using this as a consistent means to compare risks to one another. Why did I highlight these? Okay, whatever. Wow. Yeah, I love the CVSS calculator is the point of these slides. So after evaluating what the priority of a risk is, we should be tracking risks in a risk register or similar program. To iterate and scale, your governance, risk, and compliance teams should be negotiating efforts with leadership and advising on mitigating policies and solutions. Now, if you really believe that a risk cannot be fully captured by the CVSS calculator, then you should utilize the impact versus likelihood matrix to mitigate hesitation, because doing something is better than doing nothing. How do we account for inconsistencies in definitions of rare when measuring the priority of a risk? How can we reduce the amount of variance and the lack of precision in different evaluators observing the same entity? The answer is in a technique that I actually learned from 8th grade science class, US public education jokes aside. Does this look familiar to anyone in chat? And I'm just realizing now that there's a delay for chat, so I shouldn't ask live questions. If you are not familiar with what this tool is, this is a photograph of a graduated cylinder, and this is a tube that is used to measure volume. And it turns out everybody measures slightly differently, even when you're looking at the same tool. If somebody is off by 10%, at least they're consistently off by 10% compared to 5 different observers with different inconsistencies. The benefit of collecting data is to be able to observe the change between states or conditions across other measures like time. Using the same person reduces overall evaluation variance compared to different people imprecisely making the same measurement. I theorize that risk registers with one administrator reduces qualitative variance compared to every contributor of registers giving their own version of extremely likely or rare. This allows us to keep consistency and precision in prioritizing tasks. In conclusion, the emergency room, or at least mine, clearly knew that stats like oxygen, coherence, blood pressure, and heart rate were the best stats to triage emergency room patients in terms of risk. The same must happen if we are to go in any direction to start mitigating those risks. So now we've identified a ton of issues. How are we going to fix it? Prioritizing risks and vulnerabilities don't account for the effort it actually takes to remediate them. So how do we prioritize based on effort? God, I talk a lot. Okay, so there are 2 kinds of efforts, and there's like one type of effort is one with absolute order, right? You're solving an ongoing emergency, you have the luxury or experience of knowing what order things should be happening in, and these are closer analogs to playbooks, but playbooks require some kind of maturity. Then there are efforts without a clear order, and that usually is like a pile of vulnerabilities and risks. So I actually theorize that in the US, the COVID-19 vaccination authorization was analogous to how to prioritize effort. So the scope in this case for Americans, there are 300 million people in the US. And at the end of 2020, there was actually an extremely limited vaccine supply. And vaccine authorization was sorted by age and health status. It was constricted by the manufacturing rate of vaccines, and there was also the status of vaccines being used under emergency authorization use. So with these known figures, what was the best ordered or priority to distribute these vaccines? So here's a chart of my very unscientific assumption of how much effort it would take to remediate COVID while unvaccinated. We knew that the risk to the elderly, disabled, and immunocompromised generally had worse outcomes. This is compared to, so the Centers for Disease Control has like a vaccination schedule. And the only thing that you need to notice on this chart is that the number of vaccines we're eligible for and encouraged to take only grows as we get older. And there is a certain pattern identified of avoiding giving children certain vaccines during extreme periods of development like infancy or childhood. I noticed that the Department of Health and Human Services authorized the vaccine in the order of how many vaccines the age group was eligible and recommended for versus the likely impact of complications from COVID-19. The order of authorization clearly did prioritize babies and children in major development stages due to increased risk in exposure, despite, so they deprioritized babies and children in major development stages despite the fact that they had increased risk in exposure due to childcare or school. The age groups are based on how we've studied vaccines and at which age they're considered necessary. So populations are authorized, but technically the vaccine supply was still limited at that time. So it feels like so long ago, but this was the resulting order of priority of COVID-19 vaccine distribution in the US. And as an invisibly disabled person, I myself actually qualified and got it a few months before my non-disabled, non-elderly friends were eligible from getting theirs. The CDC continues to distribute, monitor the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine, Omicron variants aside, and are able to conclude that all approved vaccinations require boosters. Currently, the fourth shot is recommended for elderly and severely immunocompromised individuals, and there is an Omicron-specific booster in the works. So how do we sort security efforts that may not have an obvious order of operations? Well, first we need to pile all the ideas together, right? So identify your resolutions, mitigations, and your resource constraints. And imagine that this is a list of application security oriented projects that your team wishes to tackle. Like, how do you choose one over the other and which efforts are worth doing? I believe that you can answer this question in a product design exercise that helps you prioritize and organize your project ideas. It's called an impact versus effort matrix. So back to the list of projects your team wishes to tackle. They put it all out on these Post-it notes, and to begin the exercise, your team must order all of the ideas in a row from lowest impact to highest impact. The rule is no two projects can occupy the same X or horizontal coordinate. So get them started on that, right? This is also a nice exercise to see if your team can communicate why they believe what projects will have the impact that justifies their chosen order. So you let them do that. And after you are able to order everything based on low to high impact, your goal now is to repeat the exercise again, but on the vertical axis. And order project ideas from low to high effort, and make sure you keep the X coordinate that indicates impact. The same rule applies that no two projects can occupy the same Y or vertical axis. So let's presume that the team has done that. Now we draw some random lines, and I'll explain what the lines mean a little bit later. But in the we can see that clearly there are some quadrants to where the team has prioritized some of these efforts. In the upper left corner, this describes projects that have low impact and that are high effort. In my personal opinion, these should probably be deprioritized, as it would be considered a luxury to complete these ideas given the low payoff. The upper right quadrant hosts ideas that are seen as strategic. This is significant effort for significant payoff. The the lower left quadrant would be full of easy wins thanks to low impact and low effort. And the lower right quadrant is considered must-dos thanks to low effort, high impact. The parallel lines that are going diagonally across the chart, they're meant to be a sort of gauge for how practical your team's project ideas are. And ideally, you're within or close to those red lines. In your retrospectives, do you find that the team ends up executing a lot of luxurious ideas in the upper left quadrant that may not have the most impact to leverage? Is the team accidentally leaving must-do projects behind? You don't know until you put that all together and understand what the team sees as beneficial to do and what seems like a bit of a waste of time. Even with an impact versus effort matrix, it can be still hard to make decisions. And we are all constrained by time, resources, and budget. So, it kind of helps us visualize what can we do with what we have. The point of the impact versus effort matrix is not for accuracy of this was the best effort to prioritize. The point, again, is to reduce task initiation hesitancy. Finally, to evolve, when you retrospect your year, quarter, or sprint, you can see what was done, what was chosen, and decide what is best to do next. You can pinpoint issues with accuracy with respect to your return of investment of effort and prioritization for your team. And I know it's really hard to do retrospectives, but it really helps you utilize the wealth of data to know that you at least did something. You did good things to move the needle in terms of security culture. You chose the most impactful efforts thanks to the matrix. And just another reminder that security professionals will never win forever, ever. The castle walls are doomed to fail at some point in some way. So we know that computing relies on sorted information that allows us to recognize patterns and scale the way we solve similar broken down problems. We know that with vulnerabilities, we need to quantify their severities in order to spot trends and strategically place effort, like investing in services that could potentially eliminate an entire vulnerability class. When the outcome or threat is a little more nebulous in terms of risks, there's still value in using quantification to prioritize risks. This is best used to communicate potential proactive efforts and to leadership to justify the resources to resolve them. When you're ready with your solutions or mitigations, you either already know what to do based on experience, or you can put all the different solutions in an impact versus effort matrix. These are major oversimplifications of trade-off evaluation decisions, but this needs to be simplified because we're going to have to apply all of these thousands of little decisions to resolve incidents. You will get a lot of reports. You will have limited resources. You will have to make tough calls quickly because time is of the essence when resolving incidents. So how do you build security incident response? And let me take a quick drink here. Now we're running, right? Definitely need to stay hydrated while running. Okay, so how do you build security incident response? Beginning with our core principles to scope, quantify, recognize patterns, and scale. Let's look at how pilots are meant to resolve incidents in an aviation emergency. Now, to make sure I'm not spreading unnecessary fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is another Garthism, let's quickly look at available data related to US carriers. And I'm really sorry I didn't have time to look up Canadian carrier safety data, but flying in the US is actually incredibly safe. In the past 20 years, we've seen a 95% decrease in US air carrier fatalities in the last 20 years. Wait, I already said that, sorry. I believe that this is because the FAA, the US Federal Aviation Administration, requires pilots to follow the same patterns in all aviation emergencies. When something goes wrong in the air, the pilot's scope is the plane, the passengers, where they are, what the plane is telling them, and let me say modern airliner cockpits have a lot telling the pilot all at the same time. This is all of the signaling, right? So this is our Marie Kondo pile of information. All of that data allows pilots to organize the data that they are receiving and understand what their instruments are telling them. Previously recognized patterns in what has happened in aviation accidents contributes to modern aviation checklists. Commercial pilots require thousands of hours of training, and this is because previous experience makes them faster at choosing the right checklist, because at any given moment, there are so much that a pilot is required to manage. For example, a pilot must holistically decide how to handle all the tasks in the air. They must perform task initiation, task monitoring, task prioritization, resource allocation, task interruption, task resumption, task termination. And for every task, you bet there's a checklist. There are so many checklists that pilots strap whole computers and checklists to their thighs. These are known as knee boards. And even with references, task management requires mastery, and that dictates which checklist to use, what data to surmise from like your thigh computer or from your telemetry, on top of interpreting all the signals that are coming at you from the window, from your systems, from your computers, etc., etc. So thanks to recognized patterns in past emergencies, pilots are now able to prioritize their efforts in an emergency. There's a specific prioritized list to follow in an emergency. So like something's wrong. The pilot must aviate, navigate, then communicate in that order. And that basically means aviate, don't crash, make sure you are keeping the plane up. Navigate, do not be so distracted in diagnosing the issue that you accidentally direct the plane into an obstacle. This is also known as task fixation. Communicate, only after you've done those things, talk things through. Tell ATC so they can figure out if they need to clear your airspace or the runway. They have to organize the incoming tsunami of information, process it, then prioritize their efforts for the best possible outcome. The third step in scaling the benefits of identifying patterns. In the best case scenario, there are no crashes or fatalities. Pilots can confidentially and voluntarily file a report of the issue they encountered. Then that leads to safer skies for everyone. In the worst case scenario, the NTSB has to conduct a thorough postmortem. And unfortunately, in those cases, lessons learned are written in blood. Including the FAA, authorities have to observe incidents in aggregate, prioritize safety, passenger safety above all else, minimize the occurrence of future incidents, and provide better playbooks and checklists for all parties involved. Let's apply this framework to the 737 MAX 8 aviation accident. In Indonesia, October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea. The crash occurred 13 minutes after takeoff. People on the ground reported that the aircraft was visibly pointing downwards. Investigators recovered black box telemetry from the aircraft. And again, a black box is an aircraft equivalent system for application logging in our context. And they could tell that the plane was trying to force itself down. Pilots were receiving confusing warnings and indications from their instruments. And recall that pilots are required to aviate, navigate, then communicate. The incident was severe enough that they never completed the aviate stage of this critical protocol. The post-crash investigation determined that there was a newly added computer system called MCAS. And it turns out it wasn't documented in flight training at the time, given that this was a new aircraft. And the investigation cited a lack of training with the new system. The lack of training created unexpected behavior in the cockpit that the pilots were not trained on. The manufacturer announced as a result that it would update the aircraft software to fix the issue. It also trained pilots with an additional playbook. The playbook was simple for pilots. Upon discovery of the issue caused by MCAS, disable the system when it was suspected to be misoperating. So in our scope, we have the stricken plane, confusing warnings. In the beginning, to deal with that new plane design, MCAS was a system that was previously unknown to pilots and omitted from training manuals, and there were no relevant checklists or trainings to deal with the new MCAS system. So step one here is unfortunately omitted. Pilots were made to walk before they could crawl. In step two, they never made it out of aviate before hitting the ground. Step three, of course, was the post-crash investigation and the recommendations it issued to disable the system if it was suspect. By now, some of the similarities between security incident response and aviation incident response should be more apparent. In a security incident, the scope is one incident and all of the things that are going wrong in it. Step one is to crawl. We have to quantify and prioritize the relevant vulnerabilities and risks that the incident brings to bear. Step two is to walk. In the air, pilots need to make sense of the data they have and figure out what they're going to do about it. In security incident response, we have to figure out what efforts are going to fix the problem and prioritize them. This enables us to come up with a cohesive mitigation plan. Only with these plans can we effectively execute these prioritized efforts. Step three would be to iterate after the incident is over. Effective postmortems are key. We need to highlight our key deficiencies, avoid the resurgence of at least a particular flavor of incident, and give us refinements to our incident playbooks and we do all of this to make sure future incidents are smoother and less painful. So about 6 months into incident response leadership, pattern recognition allowed me to make a simplified workflow. And yes, I use scare quotes very liberally here. How to handle incidents consistently. This workflow was built from data from incident reports because all of my incidents had documented timelines and detailed action items for every accepted incident. So on this chart, every square or rectangle was a task, and there was usually some sort of checklist affiliated with it. Yellow rectangles, which are censored for what they actually represented, these were actually tasks that involved calling in subject matter experts. The diamonds are if-then statements to trigger the next task or checklist in the process. Another pattern that I recognized in gathering all of my incidents, fellow IMOCs or incident manager on calls were experiencing incident fatigue. And according to the data and the CVSS scores, we were accepting too many low-level incidents. In observing our postmortems, we weren't declaring incident severity soon enough. And determining incident severity became the absolute first step. So using the data from the CVSS calculator, we decided which incidents would go to incident management and which could be monitored from vulnerability management. This allowed us to only accept the highest priority incidents. And then we created additional rules to push lower priority incidents to vulnerability management. They got their own postmortem worksheet as a result. From the detailed incident report timelines, action items and their results holistically demonstrated a pattern that divided the work into three main work streams. So the first one would be remediation or mitigation, actually pushing the code to fix whatever's going on or to remove it from public access. The second stream of work would be investigation, which included understanding if there was evidence of exploitation and also the magnitude of impact of the exploit. And then the third stream was reporting obligations, and that really depended on the investigation and what our subject matter experts were considering in terms of what required us to report and what didn't require us to report. So due to the 72-hour SLAs that we had for security incident response, all streams of work had to start at the same time. Sometimes, however, even if we have followed these steps, something similarly might happen again. In March 2019, 5 months after the Lion Air Flight 610 incident, there was another 737 MAX 8 that goes down. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashes in Ethiopia. So how and why did this happen again? Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 will require its own investigation and postmortem. And when the same thing happens again, we suspect that something might be wrong in the way we are holistically investigating all of our incidents. The scope now includes 2 individual crashes, and this is a very strong signal to audit the entire system used to run investigations. You need to use the opportunity to scrutinize multiple incidents in aggregate, and not just the specifics of the incidents, but also the effectiveness of your postmortem action items and your remediations. First, the individual incident. What happened with Flight 302? They find the black box of the aircraft and see in the logs that MCAS was triggered and the plane started tilting downwards. Pilots turned off the MCAS system as trained and advised, but the outcomes are not as expected. 302 still crashes. The pilots are incensed. Pilots worldwide. They began to investigate, and thanks to logs from the black box of the aircraft, they are able to simulate the exact conditions of the situation in flight simulators. In recreating Flight 302's situation, we learned that MCAS was already pointing the plane's nose downwards. Fellow pilots discovered through the simulations that there were only 10 seconds to be able to turn off MCAS. If you did not turn off MCAS within 10 seconds of malfunction, it left the plane in an irrecoverable state. Now, we have seen how many considerations pilots must make for individual checklists, let alone tasks. Thousands of things can go wrong in the air. How could one irresponsibly force a pilot to react to something in less than 10 seconds? And let me tell you, pilots are literally trained to safely land airplanes when all engines completely fail. It does not take less than 10 seconds to do that. Conclusions from Lion Air's Flight 610 postmortem found that it put more pilots in an impossible situation. Pilots worldwide empathized that Lion's pilots would have never caught that issue in less than 10 seconds. Prevailing theory as a result of the investigations found that MCAS was governed by a single sensor. Redundant sensor inputs actually exist on other similar plane models. The MAX 8 did not have sensor disagree logic due to the singular sensor. There was no way to signal or to correct for a faulty sensor. This led to that single point of failure. MCAS points the plane downwards due to the faulty sensor, and MCAS can put the plane in an unrecoverable state if the pilots are not fast enough to remediate it, which was 10 seconds. As an aside, OWASP Top 10 includes insufficient monitoring and logging. How would you know if a single sensor is failing? Especially if you don't have other sensors to compare and correlate it to. How were investigators and pilots supposed to correct for this with insufficient monitoring and logging? The MAX 8 was grounded for almost 2 years, and there are other theories that potentially contribute to the root cause or overall effect of this, but as of today, the final report for 302 is still pending. Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 were repeat incidents, but both clearly required so much more scrutiny. When you see repeat computer or web application security incidents, you end up needing to audit your entire program holistically. Your scope now increases to all reports, especially those that are duplicates of the same repeat incident. To crawl, we have to quantify our metrics in aggregate. What we did, how we did it, why we did it, who did it, and the effectiveness of what we did about it after the fact. What were the similarities and differences between the two investigations in the case of the MAX 8? This data for multiple security incidents would allow you to better ascertain what factors make your incident response program better or worse. And to walk, we have to revisit all of our checklists and playbooks for how we handle incidents. To run, we must always be improving our incident response plans. And it is essential to have retrospective and introspective views. We have to encapsulate this with prior or similar incidents, and we must post-mortem our entire methodology. In the case of Lion Air, it was so easy to point fingers at insufficient training. The assumption that if the pilots were aware of the system and that turning it off could prevent another crash in isolation, and there was an assumption that if pilots were aware of the system, they could turn it off and prevent another crash. And in isolation, it was reasonable to add some training, make a playbook, add another checklist, and call it a day. But the Ethiopian crash demonstrated that blaming the pilots was not the correct root cause because additional training did not save the day. The pilots successfully performed the proposed playbook and did all the right things, and MCAS put the plane into the ground anyway. In hindsight, Boeing's initial plan to require more training, keep flying the plane while waiting for a software update was all technically approved by the FAA, and it had disastrous repeated results. Boeing suffered about $20 billion in fines and $60 billion lost in orders of the MAX 8. And then also an inaccurate postmortem and insufficient mitigations indicated an ultimately unsatisfactory risk analysis decision to the detriment of hundreds of lives. This actually led to the addition of greater FAA oversight in the certification process of new aircrafts. And this is a clear example of meta-analysis of incident response. Repeat incidents should force authorities to hold a mirror to the process and strive to change it for the better. One can only imagine similar introspection was happening at Boeing as well. And, there were tons of reports as a result of this, but at the end of the day, Boeing made a risk decision. And they kept the planes in the air, banking on the hope that they'd create a fix before another plane crashed. Rory Kennedy is the documentary director of Downfall from Netflix that focus on the MAX 8 failures. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I wanted to see if I could summarize it somewhat succinctly before I go. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We do not need to repeat the same sad stories. We need to be able to crawl, walk, and run, and we must learn from failure. To crawl, we need to be able to have all of our data available. We need to be able to prioritize our vulnerabilities, risks, and efforts, lest we be caught without a playbook when push comes to shove. We need to be able to track, organize, and sort through all of the data, and we should now organize what we have to build playbooks, workflow diagrams, to review every step with a critical eye, and make sure that we're getting feedback on the incident response process. Finally, we need to be able to scale out our responses to any sort of notification that we're getting so that we can plan for the future. And I find that tabletop exercises are some of the best way to simulate incidents with people who have the most power to make a difference in the smoothness of how your incidents go. We have to learn how to say no in order to prioritize only the highest priority incidents with the resources available. And with all of this, we must continue to update our playbooks, build templates for incidents, and automate what we can from a holistic perspective. Oh, sorry. Reading the same failures over and over again can make us feel unhappy, but perhaps studying history should make us feel bad. History gives us the context we need to learn from it and the wisdom to prevent it from happening again. All of this should give us the motivation for us to say never again. Mastery of failure requires accepting and learning from failure, and always remember that it is those who do not learn from history that are doomed to repeat it. These were references that I made. They were formative to my perspectives provided. Thank you for allowing me to learn from history and to stand on the shoulders of giants to manage my tiny IR program. A brief token of appreciation to OWASP Ottawa, home to some of my favorite security professionals, and also host them for OWASP meetups and talks. And you guys also have a great B-Sides conference. Everybody's awesome and super nice. And I'd like to thank every teammate, coworker, product council, CISO, every security conference, every speaker, mentor, teammate that has supported my responses to failures that I've encountered in my entire career. So thanks for empowering me to do things better. And let's all do better. Thank you so much for your time. I will gladly take questions now.
Wow. Yeah, the Max 8 thing was the gift or not the gift, but it was just wrong on so many levels. The question that in terms of the comparative analysis between aviation and medicine, we have both two very, regardless of where you're from, highly regulated fields with oversight. Software development does not necessarily have that. And so, yes, individual organizations, and I've been in those incident rooms with you. Does this mean that eventually, in the fullness of time, software engineering, at least in certain environments, needs to have some form of oversight?
I do. So there is a very severe difference in how I operate as a security professional when I am obligated to meet the requirements for PCI and GDPR and when I am not. And so at the end of the day, I find that it is a lot easier to motivate or to convince engineers This is the right thing to do, because if we don't, there are immediate monetary consequences that can result. So regulation like GDPR in terms of privacy, which we know privacy is not security, but privacy cannot exist without security. Um, the fines that GDPR has enforced on businesses that failed to have these security controls in place very clearly demonstrated a lesson to be learned. And so I could point to those articles and tell people we're in scope for GDPR. These are some of the immediate consequences we might have as a result. Please build this thing and prioritize it amongst your many other priorities.
And often this is probably very useful at the beginning of a project, because then there's at least GDPR requirements, for example, can be put in the groomed backlogged and prioritized at the beginning, as opposed to trying to bolt it on after MVP.
Yes,
But
definitely. Developers were more upset with unexpected additional requirements as a result of implicit GDPR requirements
right.
versus like if we had brought them up much sooner, which mostly policy does a good job of dictating that. But if you're just breaking out into the European market, like a lot of developers might not know what GDPR is. And so you have to educate them and then remind them these are implicit customer requirements. All of them are entitled to these rights. And if we do not fulfill them, we will get in trouble. Yeah, so definitely regulation helps in motivating these things.
Yeah, and or alternatively, not that it affects stock prices, but the risk of financial loss due to litigation. Um, Having been in those same incident rooms with you, and the method of triage for using CVS and things, CVSS, and I know that in those rooms sometimes there's a bit of drama. People are highly caffeinated. People are excited. How have you found that it calms the room? Is it a calming thing, or do you find that it people think you're delaying? I don't know. What is your reaction to that? How have you seen that reacted to?
In terms of emotional response in a situation room, I find that, and my perspective will be a little bit different, right? I am a woman in tech, and a lot of people assume that women are much more emotional than men, but I actually found that that's not the case, right? And so what I rely upon, also women's and their comments can oftentimes be dismissed. And so my repeated and tried and true strategy has always been to present data. And usually there are several leaders in the room. There might be an emotional one, and eventually a more rational actor will observe the data and say, actually, I don't think this needs to be or require as emotional of a response. The more powerful rational actor will kind of course correct for the irrational emotional actor in the room. So even myself as a low level individual contributor does not actually have to fight that battle. So the consistency, right? Playbooks. My consistency in presenting data on the situation continuously kind of batted away emotional responses until it just became culturally accepted to rely on the data instead.
Yeah, pull the Mr. Spock card on them, and that would calm them down. Um, Question from the chat: Can software architecture, King Bane, all hail King Bane, can software architecture that aligns to business needs for GDPR remove some of those last minute security changes? That's a lot to
Mm-hmm.
unpack. Can software that aligns to business needs for GDPR remove some of those last? Okay, I think I understand the question. There's a lot of words in there, and there's GDPR. Shh, shh.
So I think this largely depends on your security team's ability to do preventative action. So Security maturity models usually include like the first stages are how good are you at being reactive, how good are you at mitigating, and then eventually later on in the maturity models it becomes how good are you at being proactive. So unfortunately, like having a GRC or having a security partner like me, so what I do currently now is I ask developers, hey, bring me your tech specs, bring me your product specs, and let me spot security concerns or vulnerabilities that you might be missing in your implementation plan. And so, if I was required to, be aware of GDPR, and given that they haven't begun development yet, I'm able to warn them about some of these requirements. The way that I have seen GDPR implemented in flight was dedicated engineering and product management resources that individually chased down all of the GDPR requirements and built out systems and services that made it a little more sane. So we had an acquisition that specifically had automation to handle right to be forgotten requests. So you can architect like ways to manage the madness, and you can try to avoid like why did this happen last minute, right? Was it in your planning, like your postmortem, exactly what I said, right? Why was that so last minute? Why wasn't the team aware of these implicit requirements as a company that is required to be compliant with GDPR? Is it a is it an education component? Is it awareness component? Are we, do your developers realize that these are requirements that existed long before they even decided they were going to build something new? So you need to postmortem what your software development lifecycle looks like, and then make sure that they are aware that these are implicit requirements as a result. That's where I think architecturally you can do that.
I would. The only thing I would change to that is I don't believe it's technically a developer issue. I believe it's really a project management and a management issue because
Product as well.
that or a product management issue in that there's a target market, and that target market, if you're aware of what that market space is, that should dictate what the fiduciary compliance requirements are, and then you can sort of go through the Rolodex and pull out, oh yeah, it's GDPR for that area, and here's our list of requirements that go in at the front end of your greenfield project. Um, so it's really knowing the business and the knowing business of your market, and we haven't even begun to put two bits together in any form of programming logic or back of the napkin sort of functional diagram of implementation. So I put that sort of squarely on a management tier. I Developers code or architect to a series of requirements, and if they're not told the requirements up front, I mean, what are they going to be, hanging around the compliance bar talking GDPR with people on weekends? Of course not. So
No.
it's not so much of a developer issue in that particular case, but we've all seen those cases where, oh, we've got MVP and then there's these last minute requirements for whatever standard, and then you spin the twister dial and you have to sort of re-architect to make this Frankenstein to be able to sell in a particular market. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Similar.
and
No, it's a good point to bring up, right? I have seen in my career hackathon projects that became actual product features, but unfortunately, because it skipped all of that process, it missed the fact that it still needed to follow some of these compliance requirements. And so, while I love the enthusiasm of a hackathon, it still needs a checklist before it goes to production.
and that's the important thing is the playbook, the checklist, and things like that, because we will not remember everything to do everything at any given point in time to be able to get things out, because we'll be thinking of other things and there'll be other interruptions.
Yes,
So
as somebody with ADHD, I definitely forget a lot of things.
thank you for that question, King Bane. The question I that sort of came to mind recently because you actually had that flow chart of instant response. And I'm wondering, did you pull, I know that's based partially on your experiences and things like that, but are you aware of any um, open source, public facing, standardized checklists for instant response?
I'm definitely sure they exist because I've seen them in like various talks and B-sides, AppSec Cali, like all the application security conferences that I go to, they have some sort of checklist. And there are also software development or CI/CD pipeline checklists, right? Like your static code analysis tools essentially are another form of some sort of checklist. And there are technologies like Boost, Danger. I'm in a much more Ruby oriented environment now, but Danger, I know. Um, RoboCop, is checking. So, like, one of the most common vulnerabilities is being reliant on an out of date library, right? And
Mm,
RoboCop checks your library versions, if I remember, or is it Danger? One of the two. Checks literally your library versioning to make sure that you're not vulnerable in that way. Kathy and I, a previous person who chatted, who gave a talk at OWASP Ottawa, she and I built a hackathon project that we called uh, Clippy, and essentially we were checking Python libraries. Yeah, because it was supposed to be annoying, like the little clip, the paper clip, right? Hey, I see that you're trying to push something with a vulnerable library, or there's a library in your code base that's vulnerable. Do you want to update it? It was really funny, but yeah, automation is definitely a high level of maturity and is a great way. Like if you see developers talk about some of these static code analysis tools, it's like necessary evil. They're not happy about it, but they know that you have to do it. They need these checklists.
mm. The the checklists are very, very important. I think also the being involved with the development team at the early stages is very important. But nay, I say even more important is being part of that team.
Yeah.
But that's a talk for a different time. I'm just going to check. I believe that's all we have for questions at the moment. So I'd like to say a really big thank you for sharing. This has been really thought provoking, and I've got a bunch of post-it notes while you were talking up on my wall to check out other things. Um, so you share your slides, and we'll post them in all our usual suspect areas, and we'll look forward to your next presentation pitch sometime in the future.
Thank you for hosting me virtually, Ottawa. You're amazing.
Hang around after we sign off and we'll have a quick chat. But for everyone else, look forward to our September presentation, which I think will be online. We will have a stealth, maybe partially announced, me talking in a room with fluorescent lighting to check out that our venue we'll be able to live stream from. And until then, stay tuned and stay safe. Good night.